Hello there everyone and welcome back to my channel.
Mr. Backwards.
If you're new here, my name is Ben Brunel. I'm a professional actor living in Vancouver and I like creepy, gross, and mysterious things. Today is day 3 of my Halloweek series where I post a new video for each of the weekdays coming up to Halloween. Thursday and Friday's videos are already up on my channel and I took a break over the weekend, but we are back today to finish off the last 4 days of Halloweek. So today I'm going to be talking about the life and times of Grady Stiles Jr, aka Lobster Boy. This will also include 2 murders, one in which Lobster Boy was the killer and the second one in which Lobster Boy was the one who was killed, but we will get to that later. He was aptly called Lobster Boy because of a deformity that affected his hands and feet. This condition is known as ectrodactyly, which is a deformation of the hands and or feet which cause them to look like lobster claws, hence the name. The condition itself is also known as the lobster claw syndrome. This is characterized by the middle digits on the hands and or feet being missing and then the 2 digits on either side joined to look like lobster claws. If you're familiar with the American Horror Story series, you may have seen their season Freakshow, in which Evan Peters plays a character called Jimmy Darling, who is also known as his Freakshow name, Lobster Boy. There was a lot of artistic liberties taken between Evan Peters' character of Jimmy Darling and the real-life person Grady Stiles Jr. One of the differences is that Jimmy Darling was only affected in his hands, but Grady Stiles Jr. was affected in both his hands and his feet. Sometimes ectrodactyly or the lobster claw syndrome will only affect your hands or your feet, but unfortunately for Grady Stiles Jr., it affected both his hands and his feet. This wasn't a diagnosis that Grady's family was unfamiliar with, as a number of people in his family also suffered from ectrodactyly. However, they didn't see their condition as a handicap and they actually found out a way to profit from their deformity. They used their condition to make money at freak shows, and eventually they had so many family members, children, and grandchildren that were affected by the condition that they started their own freak show, the Lobster Family. They became a carnival staple during the 20th century. The Stiles family performances go back as far as the 1800s, but Grady Stiles Jr. definitely made a different legacy for himself in the family, and we'll get into exactly why that was. Grady Stiles Jr. was born in 1937 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to his father Grady Stiles Sr, aka the Lobster Man. Grady's father not only suffered from ectrodactyly himself, but he already had a number of kids who also shared his lobster claw syndrome, and then Grady came along. Grady was the 6th generation in his family to suffer from this deformity, and he just became another one to add to the Lobster family circus. He became a part of the freak show at the age of just 7. However, because his condition was more severe with both his hands and his feet being affected, Grady was never able to walk. Grady learned how to use a wheelchair at a young age, but he would also use his upper body to kind of walk himself wherever he needed to go. This led to Grady developing a great deal of upper body strength. The Lobster Family Circus toured off and on out of their permanent home in Gibsonton, Florida, which at the time was a notorious homebed for a lot of carny folk. The Stiles family actually made a decent living from being a freak show for people to gawk at, and because of it, Grady Stiles Jr. was pretty well off in his upbringing. In just one season, the Lobster family could make between $50,000 and $80,000. So that kind of money back in the 1940s, 1960s when Grady would have been performing mostly, today would be worth between $433,000 and $613,000. So yeah, they made a decent living. A few years into the family business, Grady Stiles Jr. met another carny named Mary Teresa. Some sources called her Maria Teresa, some sources called her Mary Teresa, but I'm just gonna call her Teresa. Teresa wasn't affected by any freak show worthy deformities herself. She actually ran away from home as a teenager and just worked at the carnival as a staff member. It was also at the carnival that she fell in love with Grady Stiles Jr. Grady and Teresa married and had several children, 2 of which inherited Grady's ectrodactyly, the lobster claw syndrome. One of Grady's sons, Grady Stiles III, and his daughter Kathy had inherited the syndrome, so they were added to the family circus as well. Life seemed to be taking out its intended course for the 7th generation of the Lobster family, but unfortunately Grady's story takes a dark turn when he begins drinking. Apparently Grady Stiles Jr. always had a bit of a temper, and he would have tantrums to the point where all the other carnies would totally avoid him. He would apparently swat at people with his clawed hands, and if he got angry enough, he would even headbutt them. But as Grady got older, his upper body just got stronger and stronger because of his use of the wheelchair and pulling himself around, and that coupled with his alcoholic tendencies led to him beating his wife and his children.
Grady Stiles used his deformed hands and feet to earn a living. Witnesses say he also used his anger, fueled by alcohol, to terrorize his family physically and emotionally.
Grady would use his clawed hands to choke his wife Teresa, which his hands were almost perfectly designed to do. They were practically built like vice grips. During one fight, Grady ripped his wife's IUD out of her body, which is a birth control device. After that fight, Teresa divorced him. Around this time, Grady left his family circus and started up his own independent freak show, and apparently he was a very abusive and evil man to work for.
Instead of feet, I was born with the flippers or the fillers of a lobster.
He is booking my show onto Abusive of America. and therefore is the boss.
For a while, Grady was just living a quiet life as a bachelor, doing his independent shows and adding chain smoking to his list of vices. He would smoke up to 60 Pall Mall cigarettes a day. However, Grady would once again thrust himself into the media spotlight in 1978 when his eldest daughter, Donna, fell in love with a man that Grady did not approve of. Donna was one of his children that did not inherit his ectrodactyly, and apparently she had somehow won her father's favor, so she was kind of his favorite child. Donna got engaged to a man named Jack Lane, and Grady very strongly objected to the wedding. Grady called the wedding a shotgun wedding, which would take on double meaning when the night before the wedding, Grady picked up a shotgun and murdered his daughter's fiancé. The news became a media frenzy, number one because of the Lobster family's notoriety, but also because Grady was out bragging about this murder. He showed absolutely no remorse for the crime and happily announced his guilt. You'd think that would mean a quick trial and a long time in prison, but Grady was certain he wouldn't serve a second in prison. Believe it or not, he was right, because he always had one ace up his sleeve: his lobster claw syndrome. Grady used his disability to his advantage for the second time in his life. The first was to make him rich and famous. The second was to get away with murder. Grady claimed that no prison could handle his disabilities, but also his illnesses. By this time, because of his excessive alcohol consumption, he had developed sclerosis of the liver. On top of that, he had also developed emphysema from his excessive smoking. And you have to remember, this was a different time. It was 1978. Not a lot of places, let alone a jail, were handicap accessible. And the court recognized that. They agreed that no facility could accommodate his disabilities on top of his medical conditions. So, after murdering his would-be son-in-law with a shotgun, Grady was sentenced to just 15 years probation and returned home. During all this, Grady married a second woman, had 2 more kids with her, started abusing that family, and then that wife left him as well. But then, surprisingly, his first wife, Teresa, left her new husband, who was a sideshow dwarf, to remarry Grady in 1989. Apparently, Grady had stopped drinking at this time, or so he told Teresa. But despite the renewed vows, Grady's abuse and violence just escalated because now he had gotten away with murder and he felt invincible. If he got away with murder, he thought he could get away with anything. During his drunken rages, Grady would yell at his family, "I killed before and got away with it. I can do it again." Kathy, Grady's daughter who had inherited his condition, attempted to get between a fight between him and her mother at one point. It was 1990, she was completely wheelchair bound and she was 7 months pregnant. Kathy said, "I told him, you prefer the bottle to your family." Then he started hitting on me with his fist. He hit me in the arm, in the jaw. He hit me to the point he knocked me out of the chair. The next morning, her womb started bleeding, but she didn't say anything. She said, "You didn't dare tell. The beatings would only get worse." Within hours, Kathy was rushed to a hospital to have an emergency cesarean section where she delivered a daughter with the same lobster claw deformities. Teresa, Grady's wife, eventually had enough. With the help of Grady's own son, Harry, they plotted the murder of Lobster Boy. Grady's son Harry was also a freak, but not like his father. He was called the human blockhead and would pound nails into plywood using his head. Just a fun little side note. Teresa hired a 17-year-old circus worker named Chris Wyant to murder her husband Grady. It was rumored that Chris Wyant had gang connections and that he himself was a hitman. He also just so happened to be one of Teresa's neighbors. Teresa paid Chris Wyant $1,500 to murder Grady on the evening of November 29th, 1992. On that night, Grady was sitting in his home in Gibsonton, Florida, watching TV like any other night, but on this night, he was not alone. Chris Wyant came up behind Grady, put the gun to the back of his head, and then shot Lobster Boy at point-blank range with a .32 Colt automatic. People weren't exactly sad to see Lobster Boy go. In fact, not only did his family hate him, but people in the community hated him so much that the funeral home couldn't find a pallbearer for his funeral.
And to this day, I don't forgive him, I don't forget him, and I don't miss him. There was too much done wrong.
The people involved in his murder were quickly arrested, and unlike Grady, they did not escape sentencing. Chris Wyant was sentenced to 27 years in prison for second-degree murder. Mary, or Maria Teresa, was given 12 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Grady and Teresa's son, Harry, got the worst out of all of them. He was labeled as the mastermind, and he was given a life sentence. In court, Teresa defended her actions, saying, "My husband was going to kill my family. I believe that from the bottom of my heart. I'm sorry this happened, but my family is safe now." Kathy also defended her mother and testified that her father was like Satan himself. Very cruel, very cold-hearted, very sadistic. Grady Stiles III told police that at the age of just 17, he had to kick down a door to save his stepmother from his father. He said, "My father was on top of her, choking her." Grady Stiles Jr. was buried alongside his father, Grady Stiles Sr., in the Showman's section of the Sunset Memory Garden Cemetery in Florida. Lobster Boy's family has since moved on. His son, Grady Stiles Jr, who is one of his children to inherit the lobster claw syndrome, now has a daughter named Sarah who did not inherit ectrodactyly. His other affected child, Kathy, named her daughter Misty, who also inherited ectrodactyly. Grady III, Kathy, and Misty still perform on occasion. His daughter Kathy has taken up acting and has actually appeared in a couple of movies as Lobster Girl or Lobster Woman, including Tim Burton's movie Big Fish. So that is the story and murders of Grady Stiles Jr, aka Lobster Boy. This video is quite a bit shorter than the other two in my Halloweek series so far, one of which was over 20 minutes and one of which was over 30 minutes, but I'm just curious to see which people prefer. Shorter ones or longer ones? The last few videos of Halloweek may be smaller videos just due to time constraints, but we'll see how that goes. Anyways, thank you as always for watching. You already know what I'm gonna do, so I'm just gonna do it. This is just a reminder that this is only day 3 in Halloweek, so subscribe to make sure you don't miss the last couple of videos, and also follow me on Instagram and Twitter, both under my name, Ben Burnell, with a Y, not a U. A follow on social media actually does help me out in my acting career because a lot of what we try to do is just trying to get exposure, so a follow or a like on social media actually does help me out, so I really appreciate it if you do. Thank you. Anyways, I will see you all tomorrow for day 4 of Halloweek. Stay spooky.
Oh, Mr. Backward, don't you know?
Ja,